Welcome to the New Books Network.
Many analysts have tried to make sense of the rise of populist strongmen around the world in recent years. Perhaps the most important explanation has centered around the international free trade arrangements that have been seen as the cause of the impoverishment of the working and middle classes in the richer parts of the world. The trade related shocks to the economy have been exacerbated by the rise of artificial intelligence and the economic uncertainty that technology has introduced into our world. Finally, there's immigration and the ethno-racial diversity it has created in places that are perhaps not so enthusiastic about it. But this is not the first experience we've had with globalization. I mean, what's the same and what's different this time around? Welcome to International Horizons, a podcast of the Ralph Bunche Institute for International Studies that brings scholarly and diplomatic expertise to bear on our understanding of a wide range of international issues. My name is John Torpy, and I'm director of the Ralph Bunche Institute at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. We're fortunate to have with us today Tara Zahra, who is Hannah Holborn Gray Professor of East European History at the University of Chicago. Her most recent book, Against the World, Anti-Globalism and Mass Politics Between the World Wars, was published by W. W. Norton in 2023. She's also the author of The Great Departure, Mass Migration and the Making of the Free World, also published by Norton in 2016, and of several other books. Thanks for joining us today, Tara Zahra.
Thank you. I'm really happy to have the opportunity to talk to you.
Great to have you. So, as I suggested in some of my setup remarks, this is not the first time we've undergone the process of what's called globalization. But I guess we call the first globalization of the 1880 to 1914 period was largely ended by the First World War. Can you tell us what you think is familiar and what's new from the first globalization compared to our own day?
Right. Well, I think I could say from the start that my own perspective on the interwar period was changed by current events. So I started the research for this book in 2016, when I think anti-globalist ideas and politics were really heating up with Brexit, the election of Donald Trump, and the rise of populist regimes, especially in the region I study, Central and Eastern Europe, but globally. So it really gave me a new perspective on the 20s and 30s. Some of the things that are very familiar are the obviously a rise in xenophobia, kind of an effort to restrict migration and secure borders. A second obvious comparison is the anxiety about free trade, and now we're seeing a kind of the beginning of a global trade war potentially. That was also what happened in the 20s and 30s. Is every state really rushed to erect protective tariffs around their borders. I think one important difference is that the anti-global moment of the 20s and 30s also saw the collapse of the international financial system. And it's not so clear today that the mobility of capital has been affected in the same way as the mobility of people and things. So that's a key difference. I think another key difference is that in both moments, we've seen anti-global ideas and politics on both the right and the left. So in neither case was it restricted to the far right. But I would say today's left-wing anti-globalism is much more focused around the environment, which was not really a concern, as far as I can tell, in the 20s and 30s. So those are some of the similarities and differences, but we could get into further detail, in finer detail if you'd like.
Sure. Well, I mean, one of the things that prompted this, my invitation was, obviously the politics of the period. And, fascism is more or less a distinctive product of this kind of post first globalization period and a reaction to it, to some of the things that you just described. So, I mean, Karl Polanyi in this book, The Great Transformation, made this argument about essentially the commodification of things like people and saw that as, more or less a kind of capitalist revolution, if you like, that led to a great deal of unhappiness among those so commodified. So, maybe you could talk a little bit about the specifically political reactions to this anti global sentiment.
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the important elements here that gave rise to this form of anti-global politics is just that you had mass politics. The sort of enfranchisement and mobilization of people in the working class and the lower middle class who had previously been excluded from politics um, coincided with the acceleration of globalization at the end of the 19th century. And that was a pretty potent formula for reaction. It meant that politicians had something to gain, votes to gain, and power to gain from playing on anxieties about globalization or pursuing anti-global policies. So I kind of do see this as a revolt more from below than above. And, I wouldn't say that the politicians who took up these causes or the states that took up these causes were opportunistic, but it was definitely about the intersection of a kind of popular revolt, the acceleration of globalization, and a new form of politics that was playing on these anxieties.
But how do you see that? I mean, do you see differences between the kind of anti-globalist reaction that, in part anyway, it was embodied in fascism, historical fascism, and what's going on today? I mean, one thing that it seems to me is, a crucial difference is that fascism had a kind of ideology. Mussolini wrote books about, his ideas about what society should be like and how it should be organized. That's not a prominent feature, as far as I can see, of contemporary, nationalist reactions to globalization. So does that make a difference, do you think?
That's an interesting question. I'm not sure. I mean, we could go back to kind of old debates about fascism and how ideological it was and how opportunistic it was. I feel like today, actually, you could probably have a similar debate that I mean, if you could, it depends a bit on how you define ideology. If an ideology has to be a positive program rather than a series of negative positions against things, against globalization, against free trade, against immigration, against wokeness, against environmental protection, then there's an ideology at work in a lot of these movements. And I would also say that the interwar anti-globalists were not at all consistent in ideology. So you had kind of anti-global ideas and policies circulating among anti-colonial nationalists like Gandhi, among socialists like the architect Adolf Loos, and among fascists. So it was ideologically extremely diverse. And that's one of the things that's most striking about it. So that you could have, from a range of political and ideological standpoints, almost, I wouldn't say a consensus, but a kind of overwhelming movement to limit or constrain or reform or slow down the pace of globalization.
So it seems to me again that, these two periods were marked aside from, economic inequalities. There was also this sense that the world was changing in dramatic ways and that people, often don't like change, even though change is in a certain sense a constant, is something that's always going on. But in these two periods, it seems to me there was, the industrialization and commercialization of everything, I suppose, in the European and North American worlds. And there's this, similar or comparable, perhaps, phenomenon going on now that has to do with AI and that sort of thing. And so I've been struck, as I mentioned when we talked previously, by the invocation of this quotation from Antonio Gramsci about the old is dying, the new cannot be born. And in this interregnum appear monsters. And, how much does that get at the kind of experience of anxiety that people seem to be feeling and recurring to political forms that reassure them.
Yeah, I think anxiety is huge, and one of the challenges of thinking about this moment is sorting out, the very real consequences of globalization economically or socially from the anxieties about it. So, for example, in the first wave of globalization, Jews often became symbols of globalization, and a lot of anxieties about globalization were projected onto them, as anti-Semitic rhetoric that featured Jews as, controlling the global economy, agents of globalism in the form of Bolshevism, migrants, and so on and so forth. So that was kind of a clear set of anxieties and a scapegoat. On the other hand, there were real consequences of globalization that affected people, and so anxiety about change, but also real change. I mean, I think the Great Depression, it really came I think now we're kinda used to the idea that, economic events on the other side of the world could affect us dramatically, but I think the idea in 1929, 1930 that the crash of the stock market in New York could, devastate a farmer in Romania, really came as a shock. So, there was a sense, not only, anxiety about change, but a sense that the world that people knew was kind of gone forever, that it was a moment of total transformation and collapse.
So, I mean, you've raised what I might here call the Jewish question, which maybe bears a little bit more exploration. And in the World War One period, the first globalization period, it seems to me Jews were both communists and Bolsheviks and dangerous in that way. And they, supposedly ran the global banking system and, conspired to rig that and that sort of thing. And I wonder how you see that playing out in our period. I mean, does it play the same kind of role? I mean, obviously, there's been a lot of debate about anti-Semitism and protests about what's going on in Gaza, but it doesn't seem to me to have had the same kind of conspiratorial cast that it had 100 years ago. But maybe you'd see that differently.
No, I think I think it's a different era and there are different scapegoats. It's interesting to me how much I mean, migrants in general are obviously targets, but there are other kind of interesting targets. The movement against trans people and gender ideology was just sort of associated somehow with a global, maybe not a global conspiracy, but almost an imperialist ideology that's taking over uh, the world. And yet at the same time, there's kind of this global anti gender movement itself. So, the targets I think have changed over time, but I think, what is similar is the sense that there are individuals and groups who become symbols of globalization or globalism that are the targets of current politics. I mean, universities maybe also are, symbols of globalism in their own way, given how international they are. So, I don't think I have clarity, but I would agree with you that it's not that the focus is certainly not on Jews in the way that it was at the turn of the 20th century.
But since you've raised the issue of universities, I think that's also worth pursuing. I mean, could you tell us a little bit about, how that played out historically? They're obviously a major target of Viktor Orban and here in the United States as well. But in the, period of 100 years ago, universities were much more sort of elite bastions and much less democratized compared to our own day. So, did they play the same role? Were they the source of, troublemakers, or was that not sort of so much a part of the picture?
I haven't seen it as being a big part of the picture. And in fact, one of the things that's kind of interesting about the first wave of globalization is that it also coincided with the rise of experts and expertise of various kinds in the social sciences, especially, but more broadly. And a lot of those experts were also mobilized by states, across the board to develop and promote anti-global policies. So, I mean, certainly in Nazi Germany, Jews were excluded from universities, and that wasn't coincidental. But at the same time, for example, one of the solutions to the kind of problem of needing to import essential resources and goods was to try and develop synthetic products. So scientists were mobilized to try, how can we create synthetic rubber? How can we make pigs have more fat? This kind of scientific endeavor. And economists and agronomists and demographers. There were a lot of different groups of experts who were mobilized to serve this kind of anti-global cause, I would say.
So you've also raised the issue now of immigration, which I got to believe plays a huge role in both of these periods. Certainly, immigration to the United States was the percentage of foreign born population in the United States was only recently superseded, if that's the right word, as the highest level of foreign-born population in the country since 1900 or 1910. I've forgotten exactly what year it was. But there's this, I think, huge problem that University of Chicago product. Aristide Zolberg once characterized in an article as the phenomenon of being wanted but not welcome. That is to say, we face a demographic problem in the wealthy part of the world these days. It's the populations are aging and declining. The fertility rates are too low to reproduce the society, et cetera, et cetera. But that's not to say that people necessarily want, the immigrants that one might argue from an economic point of view they need. So maybe you could talk a little bit about how that plays out, in the pre-World War One period and in our own time.
Absolutely. I mean, I think if you want to think about the fundamental causes behind the first wave of globalization, you said it at the beginning, industrialization. And countries that were rapidly industrializing, like the United States, just desperately needed more workers. And because news could travel fast, people in Poland and Italy who were underemployed or impoverished knew about it and took advantage of those opportunities. So those migrants were very much needed by the U.S. economy, but at the same time, you know, it's a kind of trope at this point, but migration doesn't benefit everyone equally. So it may be that it benefits economies as a whole or, you know, large groups of the population, but there are always those individuals who are the losers. And I think economic historians have established that there was a kind of cost in wages to native workers to the first wave of globalization. So it's not surprising that therefore there was a kind of rebellion against it among the groups of people who were negatively affected. And I think you see a kind of similar phenomenon today. Although I'm not sure that Americans today are quite aware of how reliant the economy has become on migration, including undocumented migration.
So, another question I'm always, interested in is the question of the role of war in the arrangements and the politics of the period that you focused on, the first globalization, so to speak, and our own day. So, I mean, I've been skeptical, for example, about the use of the term fascism to, characterize our situation because it just seems to me it was so much born of World War One and of, a clash of ideologies between, Bolsheviks or alleged Bolsheviks, communists, and, nationalists who in Italy were called fascists. In various countries around Eastern Central Europe, they had different names, but, broadly speaking, we've come to call them fascists. So I wonder if you could talk about, the importance, the role of war and its consequences in shaping the politics of the post World War One period. And again, any comparative thoughts about what's going on in our own day?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a crucial difference. And during the World War One period, I would say not just the social and political upheaval caused by the war, but the very material consequences of war. So, Allied naval blockade against the Central Powers was blamed after the war by many Germans and Austrians for the starvation and death of millions of people and the loss of the war. And, while those numbers are still debated, because it's very hard to actually determine when somebody has died of starvation or of something else related, the consequences were very immediate that people felt and had experienced how dangerous it was to be reliant on foreign trade for essential goods like food and certain kinds of resources. So that shock in particular, the closest comparison we would have in the 21st century would be COVID, which I think did reveal to people, I don't think the terms supply chain was really common in people's vocabulary before COVID and its aftermath. So, I think it did make people much more aware of where, their essential goods were coming from, and the kind of idea of onshoring rather than offshoring became kind of popular in that moment. So there's a similarity. But, the extremes weren't necessarily as it wasn't as extreme necessarily as in the First World War. And then on top of that, another similarity would be the inflationary shock of war. So it's kind of not typically remembered as kind of part of the experience of the First World War, but in the aftermath of that war, there was a huge inflation that spawned revolts around the world, especially around the costs of food. And I think, the number of incumbents who have been ousted in the past 5 years in part because of inflation, I think there's some similarity. But at the same time, we, at least in the United States, in Europe, have not experienced a mass war of the kind, like the First World War, in many, many decades. And while there's a lot of conflict in the world, it's not necessarily in those places that anti global movements are most powerful. So I think that's a key difference.
Yes, indeed. I mean, we forget, and this is why we have historians, it seems to me. We forget how, you know, catastrophic that period was. And, people came to call once there was a Second World War to add to the first. Some people began to regard this as a so called European Civil War. And many, many millions of people died. I mean, when COVID arrived, I quickly went into comparison mode and started looking into the 1918, 1919 flu epidemic. And I thought pretty quickly that, we were not going to be as badly off as, took place in that episode. So, in a certain sense, however problematic things are at the moment, they don't really, in some ways, begin to compare to the kind of catastrophic experiences of people basically throughout Europe in the early 20th century. And one of the things that we learned from that experience was to build, an international security architecture that was meant to keep that from happening. And a lot of that was driven, of course, by the invention of nuclear weapons. But I wonder, how you see the kind of experience of creating that architecture and how it might tell us, where we should be going.
Right. I mean, I think already in the late 30s, before the Second World War, people were thinking about the instability of the global economy and the rise of globalization as a cause, if not the cause, of the rise of fascism. So they were already, I guess, brainstorming about a post-war order. And, nobody wanted to return to 1918. Nobody wanted to return to 1933. And this was kind of in a difference from the immediate post-World War One moment where there was kind of an effort to return to the old economic order, even though it was not possible ultimately. So, I think those ideas ultimately came together at Bretton Woods, which, in many ways tried to make globalization compatible with democracy, you could say. That institutions like the IMF and the WTO were supposed to lessen the global inequality that was exacerbated by globalization, while the reforms that we associate with Keynesian economics, like full employment, the welfare state, a consumer-based economy, we're supposed to address domestic forms of inequality or instability. And then, of course, the a new exchange system was intended to kind of combine the benefits of globalization with some flexibility for governments to, inflate or deflate their currencies in response to current conditions. That that kind of agreement was really undermined by the Cold War, but I do feel like it gives us, I think it gives us a sense of what would need to happen to restabilize things. And I don't think right now there's the political will to do that, but one could imagine a sort of second Bretton Woods that would in some ways restructure the architecture of the global economy to address 21st century needs and concerns.
So do you think that system is reformable, salvageable, or needs to be replaced?
I think there are elements of it that were actually quite powerful and that remain with us today that are, maybe some of the reasons that this round is different from the last one. That 2008 was a big shock, but it wasn't the Great Depression. So I don't know. I don't think we need to throw out every idea that we've had over the last 80 years to kind of prevent another Great Depression. I think there have been lots of reforms that have been successful, but at the same time, so many of those building blocks of Bretton Woods, especially I think the welfare state, have been basically dismantled. And so, I don't know what it will look like in the next round, but I think there were some good intentions and good ideas there, even if they were ultimately it didn't kind of quite work out in reality. And one of the points of Bretton Woods was that it was supposed to be a very multilateral system, and that got undermined by the Cold War almost immediately, right? So, and I don't think there's much political will right now for multilateral politics, but you never know. I do think if you think about one of the things that also came out of the Second World War, or the ideas were there before, but maybe was institutionalized, is a more regional framework for economics and politics. So the European Union, for example. And those regional blocks in some ways represented a middle ground also between a kind of protective autarkic system and a kind of total globalized liberal free market system. And so I wouldn't be surprised if we saw some kind of return to those ideas, those of regional economic blocks.
Right. It does seem as though to some extent that's the direction things seem to be going in. I'm blanking on the term, but the idea of sort of zones of interest or what's the phrase that I'm forgetting now? Um, that the United
Spheres of
States
influence.
spheres of influence. Thank you. That the United States would, as the Monroe Doctrine to some extent suggests, we'll have, our interests in the Americas, and the Russians will have their interest, and is a sphere of interest and sphere of influence, Chinese, etc. So, maybe that will make happier some of the parts of the world that aren't so happy these days. Maybe it's kind of heading in that direction.
Yeah, I think that, again, there's a fine line sometimes between spheres of influence and imperialism. And that was true. I mean, during the Second World War, the Nazi government kind of euphemistically framed their conquest of Europe in terms of establishing a regional sphere of influence, as did the Japanese in East Asia. So I guess the issue is to kind of shift from that imperial model to one in which countries are more on equal playing fields within a particular regional bloc.
Okay, well, on that optimistic note, I want to bring this episode to a close. I want to thank Tara Zara for sharing her insights about the new order that seems to be unfolding in the world or that's struggling to be born. Look for International Horizons on the New Books Network, and remember to subscribe and rate International Horizons on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. I want to thank Claire Centofanti for her technical assistance, as well as to acknowledge Duncan McKay for sharing his song International Horizons as the theme music for the show. This is John Torpy saying thanks for joining us, and we look forward to having you with us for the next episode of International Horizons.